I was part of a classified Antarctic research project. We unleashed something we couldn't stop. Written by Pentyworth 223. This isn't the story I thought I'd be telling about my life's work. I thought I'd come out of this as a name in scientific history. Instead, I'm sitting here, scribbling this down in the dying light of a flickering bulb, with the wind howling above me like a living thing. If you're reading this, it means someone found it. Maybe you'll think it's fiction, or just another internet hoax. Believe me, I'd prefer it that way. But I need someone to know the truth about what happened at Facility Thule. You've probably never heard of it. That's by design. It's buried under layers of classified files and military contracts, somewhere on a map of Antarctica labeled as unexplored. But I was there. I saw what they pulled from the ice. I was one of the people stupid enough to believe we could study it. And now, I'm probably one of the last people alive who knows why no one will ever go back. Facility Thule wasn't a place you volunteered to work at unless you were desperate. I was desperate. My academic career had dried up after my last project fell apart. Too many grants wasted, too many questions left unanswered. So when an unmarked envelope appeared in my mailbox with an offer to join a high-priority research expedition, I didn't hesitate. The details were scarce, but the pay was generous, and the opportunity was tantalizing. A classified government project, studying something ancient buried deep under the Antarctic ice. Who wouldn't want to be part of that? Getting there was the first test of endurance. A flight to the southernmost tip of South America, then an old creaking cargo plane that landed on a strip of ice in the middle of nowhere. From there, a tracked vehicle carried me across the frozen wasteland, its engine groaning against the wind and cold. The driver didn't speak much. He just pointed ahead to the horizon where the facility finally came into view. A dark metal monolith rising from the endless white, its edges sharp against the flat landscape. The surface structure was minimal, just a reinforced hangar and a few maintenance outbuildings. The real facility was underground, connected by a single freight elevator that descended almost a mile into the ice. It wasn't until the doors closed behind me and the hum of the elevator began that I realized how deep I was going. By the time the doors opened again, I felt like I'd left the world behind entirely. The underground complex was a marvel of engineering. Long, sterile hallways branched out like arteries leading to labs, living quarters, and storage rooms. Everything was lit by harsh, fluorescent lights that made the air feel colder than it already was. I met the rest of the team in the main conference room that first night, each of us sizing each other up in the glow of a projector displaying a map of the facility. The team was small, 7 of us in total. Dr. Elena Sharp, our lead scientist and a virologist who carried herself like she was the smartest person in the room, and she probably was. Dr. Aaron Lynn, a biochemist with a wry smile and a knack for making himself indispensable. Sarah Knox, the systems technician, quiet but quick, always scanning the room like she was 3 steps ahead of everyone. Captain Roger Blackwell, our head of security. He rarely spoke, but his presence filled the room. Dr. Alice Harlow, an immunologist who never seemed to stop working. Victor Reyes, the operations manager who handled logistics with military precision. And me, Dr. Mark Calloway, microbiologist. At first, I felt like the odd one out. But once I learned what we were studying, I realized I wasn't just part of the team, I was at the center of it. Dr. Elena Sharp, our lead scientist and a virologist who carried herself like she was the smartest person in the room, and she probably was. Dr. Aaron Lynn, a biochemist with a wry smile and a knack for making himself indispensable. Sarah Knox, the systems technician, quiet but quick, always scanning the room like she was 3 steps ahead of everyone. Captain Roger Blackwell, our head of security. He rarely spoke, but his presence filled the room. Dr. Alice Harlow, an immunologist who never seemed to stop working. Victor Reyes, the operations manager who handled logistics with military precision. And me, Dr. Mark Calloway, microbiologist. At first, I felt like the odd one out. But once I learned what we were studying, I realized I wasn't just part of the team, I was at the center of it. It was hard to put into words. At first glance, it was just a smear of dark matter under a microscope, unresponsive to any of the usual tests. It didn't move, didn't react to heat, cold, or radiation. But when I looked at it for too long, I had the distinct feeling it was watching me back. The days turned into weeks, and the isolation began to wear on all of us. Outside, the Antarctic wind howled endlessly, a reminder of how far removed we were from the rest of the world. Inside, we threw ourselves into our work, trying to unravel the mystery of specimen Z14. It was unlike any organism we'd ever seen. Its cellular structure defied categorization, and its genetic code was, well, it didn't match anything we'd ever sequenced. It wasn't just ancient, it was alien. It was Sarah who first noticed the patterns. I remember the way her voice trembled when she called me over to her workstation in the Red Room. "Mark," she said, gesturing for me to look at her screen. "Tell me I'm imagining this." I leaned over and peered at the microscope's connected monitor. The image was a magnified view of specimen Z14 on a new substrate we'd introduced, a nutrient-rich agar infused with trace elements to simulate its potential natural environment. At first, it looked like a familiar smear of black, glossy cells. But then I saw what Sarah meant. The bacteria wasn't just spreading randomly, it was forming shapes. Intricate patterns emerged as the cells migrated across the substrate, spirals, hexagonal grids, and something that resembled branching tree roots. They weren't natural growth formations. They were too precise, too deliberate. "Is it reacting to something?" I asked, feeling a shiver crawl up my spine. Sarah shook her head, her brow furrowed. "I haven't introduced any new stimuli. I just prepped the substrate and placed it under the microscope. It started doing this on its own." We decided to show Dr. Sharp. When she arrived, she stared at the screen for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then, with a clipped tone, she ordered us to replicate the conditions on multiple slides and document everything meticulously. For the next few days, we worked in shifts, monitoring specimen Z14 as it continued to grow and change. The patterns became increasingly complex. On one slide, it formed something resembling a perfect spiral galaxy. On another, it created an almost mechanical-looking grid, like the gears of a clock. At first, Dr. Sharp dismissed it as a biological anomaly, some sort of bizarre, ancient survival mechanism we couldn't yet comprehend. But then the patterns started to repeat. It was subtle at first, small, recurring elements hidden within the larger designs. A spiral within a spiral, a specific sequence of branching lines. The more we looked, the more we saw. Sarah was the first to suggest what none of us wanted to say out loud. "It's not random." During our next team meeting, the room felt tense. Everyone was gathered around the central table, where a monitor displayed a time-lapse video of specimen Z14's growth over the last 72 hours. The patterns were undeniable now, shifting between geometric precision and what could only be described as organic art. "It's responding to its environment," Dr. Sharp said, pacing the room. "We know that much, but this," she gestured at the monitor, "this suggests a level of organization we've never seen in bacteria before." "It's intelligent," Sarah said bluntly, breaking the silence. "Or at least it's acting like it is." Captain Blackwell frowned from the corner of the room, his arms crossed. "Intelligent bacteria? That's a hell of a leap." "It's not a leap," I said, surprising even myself with the conviction in my voice. "It's adaptive, reactive. It's using its growth to communicate. We just don't know what it's saying yet." Dr. Harlow, who had been quietly reviewing notes, finally spoke. "If it's intelligent, then it has a purpose. The question is, what does it want?" Dr. Sharp proposed an experiment to test specimen Z14's response to direct stimuli. If it was intelligent, she argued, it would show deliberate reactions to controlled environmental changes. The team divided into shifts to observe the organism around the clock. We introduced light, sound, electromagnetic fields, and various chemical compounds. The results were subtle but consistent. The bacteria adapted to every variable we introduced, and its patterns changed in response. Then, on the 7th day, it did something none of us expected. Dr. Lin had been running his shift when it happened. We all rushed to the red room after his panicked call came over the comms. When we arrived, he pointed at the monitor, his face pale. "It's writing." At first I thought he was exaggerating, but when I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. Specimen Z14 had formed a grid of symbols across the substrate. They were crude, but unmistakably intentional. Rows of shapes that resembled a primitive script. "What the hell is this?" Blackwell muttered, stepping closer to the screen. "It's language," Sarah said. "Or some kind of proto-language." Dr. Sharp's voice was steady, but I could see the strain in her expression. "If it's communicating, then it's aware of us. We need to proceed carefully." The discovery of the symbols left the team in an uneasy mix of awe and dread. The idea that the bacteria was communicating, or at least trying to, wasn't something we were prepared for. Dr. Sharp decided we'd take a multi-pronged approach, replicate its patterns, study the symbols, and monitor its behavior for any signs of escalation. Captain Blackwell made it clear that he didn't agree. "This thing isn't some cute lab pet," he said during a heated discussion in the conference room. "It's already acting outside the bounds of nature. We don't know what it's capable of." "Which is exactly why we need to study it," Dr. Sharp replied, her voice cold and cutting. "If this organism is intelligent, it's a discovery that could change everything we know about life. And if it gets out?" Blackwell leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "Then what? We're sitting on a biological time bomb." No one had an answer to that, but the decision was made. The experiments would continue. Blackwell scowled but didn't press the issue further. For now. I'll admit, I was fascinated. Sarah and I worked late into the night replicating the symbols specimen Z14 had created, using a sterile metal probe to etch similar patterns into the nutrient substrate. At first, nothing happened. The bacteria sat still under the microscope, inert as it had been when we'd first found it. Then slowly, it began to move. The black smear stretched and twisted, its cells rearranging themselves into a new formation. A response. It wasn't a perfect match to what we had etched, but the similarities were unmistakable. It had understood. Sarah gasped beside me, her hand covering her mouth. "It's answering us." We repeated the process, sending increasingly complex patterns and documenting the responses. Each time, the bacteria seemed to reply, forming symbols that were more intricate, more deliberate. Over time, we noticed certain recurring shapes, figures that resembled spirals, latticework, and even crude representations of eyes. "It's like it's learning," Sarah said one evening, her voice tinged with both excitement and fear. "It's adapting to the way we communicate." While Sarah and I focused on the direct communication attempts, Dr. Harlow and Dr. Lin threw themselves into analyzing the symbols. They broke the recurring shapes into categories, trying to determine if they represented letters, numbers, or something else entirely. Dr. Harlow theorized that the bacteria's language might be a combination of biological signals and geometric codes, a form of expression completely alien to human understanding. The sound of shattering glass rang through the red room, followed by a wet, gurgling hiss that made my blood run cold. Time seemed to slow as we all turned to the shattered containment chamber. Black liquid oozed from the broken vessel, moving in tendrils that writhed like living things. It wasn't just a spill, it was moving with intent. "Everyone out now!" Blackwell barked, his hand on his sidearm. Sarah froze, her wide eyes locked on the spreading black mass. I grabbed her arm, yanking her toward the door. Dr. Sharp hesitated, clutching her tablet like it was her lifeline. Blackwell shoved past her, hitting the emergency containment button on the wall. A loud hiss filled the room as the steel shutters began descending over the broken chamber. But the bacteria was faster. Before the shutters could fully close, the liquid surged upward, spilling into the ventilation grates above. It moved like it was alive, climbing the walls in slick, twisting streams. I could hear the faint crackle of electronics shorting out as the tendrils made contact with the control panels. "Move! Move!" Blackwell shouted, pushing us into the corridor. The sirens wailed throughout the facility as Blackwell slammed his hand on the intercom panel. His voice echoed over the speakers, cold and commanding. "This is Captain Blackwell. The Red Room containment has been breached, initiating full lockdown. All personnel evacuate to designated safe zones immediately. Dr. Sharp rounded on him as we sprinted down the hall. You don't have the authority to shut us down. That organism is loose, Blackwell snapped. I don't care if it's a miracle of science or a goddamn alien. It's not staying contained, and if you keep slowing me down, you won't stay alive. We reached the central hub of the facility, where the corridors split into multiple branches. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting the white walls in an eerie strobe-like glow. Sarah was breathing heavily beside me, clutching her tablet to her chest. It's in the vents, she whispered. If it's in the air system, it could spread to the whole facility. And to us, Dr. Harlow added grimly, her gaze fixed on the vents lining the ceiling. As we tried to regroup, a deep rhythmic hum began resonating through the walls. It wasn't part of the facility's normal operations. It was low, vibrating, almost organic. The sound sent a dull ache through my skull, like it was burrowing into my brain. What is that? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, Dr. Lin stumbled forward, clutching his head. I don't feel right, he muttered, his voice slurred. We turned to him just as he dropped to his knees. Black veins spidered out across his neck, visible even beneath his pale skin. His breathing grew shallow, and he looked up at us with wide, bloodshot eyes. It's in me, he whispered, his voice choked. I can feel it. Before he could finish, his body convulsed violently, and a dark liquid began seeping from his mouth. The same black substance from the bacteria. Get back, Blackwell shouted, pulling his weapon. Dr. Sharp stepped forward, her hand outstretched. No, we can save him. We need to study. A sharp crack echoed through the corridor as Blackwell fired. Lynn's body jerked before collapsing to the floor, motionless. The silence after the shot was deafening. Dr. Sharp stared at Lynn's lifeless body, her face pale with rage. You didn't have to kill him, she shouted. He was gone, Blackwell said coldly, lowering his weapon. You saw what was happening to him. That thing is inside him now, and I'll be damned if I let it spread to the rest of us. Sharp glared at him, her fists clenched. You don't understand what we're dealing with. That organism, whatever it is, could be the key to something bigger than any of us. You just destroyed a chance to learn how it works. And you just destroyed a man, Harlow added quietly, her voice trembling. The tension in the group was palpable, the air thick with anger and fear. Blackwell turned to me, his expression hard. We don't have time for this. Either we shut this thing down or we die with it. Sharp stepped forward, her voice icy. I'm not abandoning this research. If you want to run, go ahead, but I'm staying and I'm finishing what we started. I hesitated, staring at the others. Dr. Sharp's insistence on staying felt reckless, but Blackwell's determination to shut everything down was a cold reminder of how dire things had become. I swallowed hard, stepping toward Blackwell. I'm with you, I said quietly. He nodded sharply, already turning back toward the central control panel. Dr. Sharp glared at me, her face twisted with betrayal, but I couldn't bring myself to look at her. Not with the sound of that low, rhythmic hum vibrating through the walls like a heartbeat. Fine, Sharp snapped. Go, run. But don't think you can destroy this without me finishing my work. I didn't respond. There wasn't time to argue. Blackwell motioned for Harlow, Sarah, and me to follow him down the corridor. We're heading to operations, he said. We'll shut off the air system and isolate the breached sectors. What about her? Sarah asked, glancing nervously at Sharp as she turned back toward the Red Room. She's made her choice, Blackwell replied, his tone cold. And I'm not risking anyone else for her. The corridors were a blur of flickering lights and distant sounds, creaks, groans, and the occasional hiss of air escaping through unseen cracks. The bacteria was spreading, and it was changing the facility as it moved. As we passed an observation window, I caught a glimpse of the black substance crawling along the walls of a storage bay, its tendrils splitting into fractal-like branches that pulsed faintly. It was alive in a way I couldn't comprehend, and it was spreading faster than I'd thought possible. We'll cut the vents here, Blackwell said, stopping at a control panel mounted on the wall. He keyed in a series of commands, but the screen flashed red with an error message. System override, Sarah said, her voice trembling as she examined the panel. It's locked us out. Blackwell swore under his breath. Then we'll do it manually. We need to get to the operations room. We pressed on, the air growing warmer and more humid the deeper we went. It wasn't natural. This far underground, the facility was always freezing, but now the metal walls were damp and a faint organic smell clung to the air. It's changing the environment, Harlow whispered, like it's colonizing the area. No talking, Blackwell snapped. Keep moving. We reached the operations room just as the lights dimmed again. Blackwell kicked open the door, motioning for us to follow. Inside, the room was filled with rows of monitors and control panels, all flickering erratically. The bacteria had already reached this area, black tendrils stretched across the ceiling, pulsating faintly as if alive. Work fast, Blackwell said, pulling Sarah toward the main control console. Can you shut down the vents from here? She nodded nervously, her fingers flying over the keyboard. If the system hasn't been fully corrupted, I might be able to isolate the ventilation zones. I kept watch near the door, my heart pounding as I scanned the darkened corridor. The low hum was louder now, resonating through my chest like a second heartbeat. And then, faintly, I heard something else. Wet, shuffling footsteps. Hurry, I whispered, gripping the edge of the doorframe. I'm trying, Sarah hissed. This system's been half-eaten by whatever the hell that thing is. Harlow stepped up beside her, pointing to a sub-menu. Try rerouting power through the auxiliary controls. If we isolate the energy flow, a loud crash cut her off. The corridor behind me went dark, and a wet slithering sound echoed toward us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It's here, I whispered. Blackwell raised his weapon, stepping past me into the hallway. His flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the glistening black surface of the bacteria creeping along the walls. But there was something else, a shape moving within the darkness. Stay back, Blackwell ordered, his voice steady. Keep working, I'll handle this. The shape emerged from the shadows and my stomach dropped. It was Lin, or what was left of him. His body was barely recognizable, covered in a slick black coating that glimmered in the dim light. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. His eyes, now completely black, locked onto us. Lin, Harlow whispered, stepping forward. Stop, Blackwell shouted, but it was too late. Lin, or the thing controlling him, lunged forward, faster than I thought possible. Blackwell fired, the gunshot echoing through the room, but the creature barely flinched. It crashed into him, sending both of them sprawling to the floor. Run, Blackwell shouted, struggling against the writhing mass that used to be Lin. Sarah and Harlow hesitated, but I grabbed them both, pulling them toward the far end of the room. We can't help him, I shouted. We need to finish the lockdown. We reached the backup controls at the far end of the room, where Sarah frantically keyed in the last few commands. The room shuddered as the ventilation system groaned to life, redirecting airflow away from the breached sectors. It's working, Sarah shouted, her voice shaky, but as the vents sealed and the airflow shifted, the black mass that had been Lin turned toward us, its body writhing and contorting unnaturally. It let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a gurgle, then lunged forward. Blackwell, bloodied and barely able to stand, raised his weapon one last time. Go, he rasped, his voice barely audible. Finish this. Before we could argue, he fired again, hitting the control panel beside us. Sparks flew, and the entire room plunged into darkness. The room was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of burning circuits and something metallic, almost coppery. I could still hear that thing, the creature that used to be Lin, moving in the darkness. Its slick, jerky movement sent chills down my spine. Blackwell's ragged breathing had stopped, leaving only the sound of the bacteria's low, pulsating hum. Move, I hissed, pulling Sarah and Harlow toward the emergency exit at the back of the operations room. My fingers scrambled over the wall until I found the handle and wrenched the door open. The corridor beyond was dimly lit by the red glow of emergency lights. The bacteria had already begun to seep through the vents here, its black tendrils spreading along the walls like veins. The air was hot, heavy, and wrong, making it hard to breathe. We need to head to the freight elevator, Sarah whispered, clutching her tablet like it was a lifeline. "If the power's down, that elevator isn't going to work," Harlow snapped. Her voice was tight, trembling, as though she was barely holding it together. "We don't have a choice," I said, leading the way. "If we stay down here, we're as good as dead." The deeper we went into the facility, the more it became clear that containment had failed. The bacteria wasn't just spreading, it was consuming. Entire sections of the walls and floors were coated in the glistening black substance, which pulsed faintly, almost like it was breathing. Every so often, we'd pass something that used to be human. Shadows moved in the periphery, shapes that were hunched, twisted, and wrong. We didn't stop to look too closely. At one point, we passed through a storage bay where a large section of the ceiling had collapsed. The bacteria was spilling down like a waterfall, pooling on the floor, and stretching toward us in slow, deliberate movements. "It's hunting us," Harlow whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't reply. She was right, and we all knew it. When we reached the elevator, my heart sank. The control panel was dark, unresponsive. The emergency generator was offline. "Of course," Sarah muttered, staring at the dead panel. "It's too much to hope for anything to go right." "We'll have to restart the auxiliary power," Harlow said. "There's a generator in the engineering bay on the lower level." "We can't go back down," Sarah said, her voice rising. "It's spreading too fast." "We don't have a choice," I said. "If we don't get the generator online, we're stuck down here." Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting to the black tendrils creeping along the ceiling. Finally, she nodded, and we turned back toward the lower levels. The engineering bay was a nightmare. The bacteria had overtaken nearly every surface, its tendrils forming strange, organic shapes that glimmered faintly in the dim light. The air was thicker here, almost suffocating. "Let's make this quick," I said, stepping carefully over the black sludge that coated the floor. The generator was a massive machine tucked into the far corner of the bay. Harlow moved toward it, inspecting the control panel. "It's mostly intact," she said, "but we'll need to purge the system before it can reboot. That means overriding the safety protocols manually." "How long will that take?" I asked. 10 minutes, maybe 15, she replied. If the bacteria hadn't corrupted the entire system. As Harlow worked on the generator, Sarah and I kept watch. The low hum of the bacteria seemed louder here, resonating through the walls. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement in the shadows, but it was impossible to tell if it was real or just my imagination. Then we heard it, a wet, shuffling sound, coming from the far side of the room. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and froze. One of the creatures was standing in the doorway, its twisted form silhouetted against the dim emergency lights. It wasn't Lynn, but it had the same mottled gray skin, the same black veins spidering out across its body. Its head tilted unnaturally, as though it was studying us. "Keep working," I whispered to Harlow, my voice barely steady. Sarah moved closer to me, clutching a metal wrench she'd grabbed from a nearby table. "What do we do?" she whispered. The creature took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. I could hear the wet squelch of its feet on the floor. "Stay back," I said, raising a crowbar I'd picked up earlier. The creature lunged, and everything became a blur. It took all three of us to bring it down. Sarah swung the wrench with all her strength, cracking its skull, but the thing barely seemed to notice. I slammed the crowbar into its torso, sending it staggering back, and Harlow managed to grab a nearby fire extinguisher, spraying it in the face to disorient it. Finally, I drove the crowbar into its chest, and it collapsed with a guttural, wet scream. The black veins receded slightly, but the damage was done. "We need to move faster," Harlow said, her voice shaking. She finished the override just as the tendrils began creeping toward the generator, and the machine roared to life. The lights flickered back on, and a surge of power hummed through the facility. "Let's go," I shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward the exit. We made it back to the elevator, slamming the panel to call the lift. The sound of the machinery powering up was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. But as the elevator doors slid open, I turned back and saw something that made my stomach drop. The tendrils weren't retreating. They were moving faster now, converging on the elevator shaft like they knew what we were trying to do. "Hurry!" Sarah shouted, shoving me inside. The doors slid shut just as the black mass reached the edge of the shaft. I could see it writhing, pressing against the seams of the elevator like it was searching for a way in. As the elevator ascended, I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding. We'd bought ourselves some time, but I knew it wasn't over, not yet. The elevator groaned as it climbed toward the surface, the hum of its motors almost drowned out by the pounding of my heart. None of us spoke, our breaths shallow as we watched the numbers tick upward. Every so often, the walls would tremble, and I wondered if the bacteria was already climbing after us. When the doors finally slid open, a blast of cold air hit my face. It was a shocking contrast to the suffocating heat below. The surface facility was dimly lit, its emergency lights casting long shadows across the walls. "Where's the plane?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp with panic. "It's in the hangar," I said, glancing toward the main entrance. The steel doors loomed ahead, heavy and imposing, but if we could make it to the aircraft inside, we had a chance to get out of here. "We're not leaving until we stop this," Harlow said firmly, her eyes locking with mine. "We can't stop it," Sarah snapped. "It's everywhere. You saw what it did down there. Do you really think we can contain it?" "We have to try," Harlow replied. "If it gets beyond this facility, it won't stop. It'll spread. The whole world is at risk." I hesitated, torn between the two. Harlow was right. If the bacteria reached the outside world, it would be catastrophic. But Sarah was right too. The odds of containing something this aggressive were slim at best. In the end, we decided on a desperate compromise. One of us would prepare the plane while the others rigged the facility's power core to overload. If we couldn't contain the bacteria, we'd destroy the entire base, burying it under a mountain of ice and steel. "We'll only have one chance at this," Harlow said as we moved through the surface facility. She'd already pulled up a schematic of the base on her tablet, highlighting the power core deep in the engineering sector. "The core's reactor is designed to withstand almost anything, but if we can force it to overload, the resulting explosion will collapse the facility. And us along with it," Sarah muttered. "Not if we time it right," I said, trying to inject a confidence I didn't feel. The bacteria reaches the surface. As we split up, Sarah heading to the hangar while Harlow and I made our way toward the power core, I noticed the first signs that the bacteria had reached the surface. It was subtle at first, a faint sheen of black along the corners of the walls, a pulsing hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air. But as we descended back into the facility's lower levels, it became impossible to ignore. The tendrils were here. They moved faster now, stretching across the walls and floors like an invading army. "It's adapting," Harlow said grimly, as we dodged a mass of writhing black veins. "The longer it's active, the smarter it gets." I didn't respond. I was too focused on moving forward, my thoughts a blur of fear and determination. The power core was housed in a massive, reinforced chamber at the heart of the facility. The room was bathed in a harsh red light, and the hum of the reactor filled the air. It was designed to withstand catastrophic failures, but we weren't here to rely on its safety features. We were here to overload it. "Start the override sequence," Harlow said, handing me her tablet. "I'll keep watch." My fingers trembled as I keyed in the commands. The reactor's interface was sluggish, its systems partially corrupted by the bacteria. As I worked, I could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of what we were trying to do pressing down on me. "We don't have long," Harlow said from behind me. Her voice was tight. "It's coming." The bacteria surged into the reactor room like a living tide, its tendrils stretching toward us with terrifying speed. Harlow fired a flare gun she'd grabbed earlier, the bright light momentarily forcing the mass to recoil. "Keep going," she shouted, reloading. I barely heard her, my focus locked on the tablet. The override sequence was almost complete, the reactor's safeguards steadily disengaging. "We're out of time!" Harlow screamed as the tendrils surged forward again, enveloping the far wall. "Done," I shouted, slamming the final command into the tablet. The reactor let out a deep, ominous hum, the temperature in the room spiking as the overload sequence began. We ran. The corridors were a blur as we raced back toward the surface, the bacteria closing in behind us. I could hear it, wet, slithering sounds that grew louder with every step. When we reached the hangar, Sarah was already in the plane, the engines roaring to life. She waved frantically as we sprinted toward the open ramp. "Move, move, move!" she screamed. We barely made it inside before the ramp began to close. The plane lurched forward, the roar of its engines drowning out everything else. Through the small window, I could see the facility collapsing behind us. The ground trembled as the reactor reached critical mass, a blinding flash of light erupting from below. The shockwave hit the plane a moment later, sending us tumbling through the air. The plane steadied as Sarah fought for control, the roar of the explosion fading into the distance. We flew in silence, the weight of what we'd just done hanging heavy in the air. "Did it work?" Sarah asked finally, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I didn't know. As the horizon stretched out before us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of specimen Z14. It was too smart, too adaptable. And even as we left the Antarctic behind, I couldn't stop thinking about the symbols it had shown us. The spirals, the grids, the eyes. It wasn't just trying to survive. It was waiting.